Introducing Tim Kelly. He's a columnist and policy advisor at the Future Freedom Foundation in Fairfax, Virginia. That's FFF.org. And he's a correspondent for Radio America's Special Investigator, as well as a political cartoonist. You can find his piece, The Mad Myth, at FFF.org/comment. Welcome to the show, Tim. How are you doing?
Not bad. Yourself?
I'm doing great. Appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's an interesting thing to me. It's sort of a side issue to your article in a way, but isn't it interesting how little anybody cares about nuclear weapons policy at all? And if they ever think about it at all, the actual conventional wisdom is nuclear weapons will never be used as long as everybody has lots and lots of nuclear weapons. So don't worry about it. Go back to worrying about anything but the issue of the H-bomb.
Yeah, considering that many governments have assumed the godlike power to destroy the world over, I would think, with relatively trivial issues, it is something. And the irony is that there's so much ink spilled about Iran and its supposed program, but there's nothing said about the thousands of missiles that the United States retain. I'm not sure how much Russia still has, but they still have many still on hair trigger alert. And I think your interview last week, or a couple weeks ago, Daniel Ellsberg spelled it out very well. So it's hard for me to improve upon that, about the insanity and the immorality of retaining our land-based ICBMs when we have a submarine-based, arsenal that was more than adequate to do what MAD or deterrence is supposed to do. So why are these things retained? And you all got into the fact that billions of dollars are spent on these states, and that's what's horrifying. A lot of it just I think the inertia of all the money that goes into these programs that maintains them, and it's just pork barrel politics. That's horrifying to consider. I mean, that policy can be driven by such by blind greed. But that's politics. What can I say?
Yeah, well, as much as I don't want to believe that's true, I know how it goes, and I still just want to believe that. Come on now, when it comes to hydrogen bombs and how many we're to have and what's to be done with them and which services would use them and where they're to be deployed and these kinds of things, it couldn't possibly be that it just comes down to lobbying and getting congressmen drunk and steak dinners and this kind of thing, measly bribes to create a pro-H-bomb industry policy. It just can't be, and yeah, I know it's true.
Well, it feeds on stuff. I listened to an interesting interview with I wish I could get his name, but he gets into the science of alternative nuclear energy, which involves thorium, I believe, was it. And I'm not an expert on this. I don't want to get into that. But what he was talking about, how the arms industry drove the civilian nuclear industry in certain ways, because there was they both wanted to develop fissile material. And it kind of warped the development of nuclear power in the 60s and 70s into this, what some people believe is an unstable, source of power, with the events of Fukushima and Chernobyl. And that's, so there isn't, I don't think there's a Rosetta Stone answer to this stuff. There's one issue. There's a lot of, like any of these things, there's overlapping agendas here, none of which I think are legitimate on their own. But going back to the essential nature of nuclear warfare, it's important to point out, and again, I want to point out that interview with Daniel Ellsberg last week or a week or so ago, it was basically based on a hoax, a lie, that these weapons were never necessary to defend the country. They were designed because some scientists got together and they were endowed with billions of dollars from the U.S. government during the war. And as the program developed throughout the war, by the time the bombs were ready to be tested and used, the Axis powers had been defeated. But they wanted to test this bomb. And many within the government, James Byrne, within the Truman administration, wanted to use it as a kind of something to show off to the Soviets, because they anticipated a showdown with the Soviets after the war. It's kind of funny because they had already anticipated the Cold War before the war had ended. And if you do the literature on this, the studying on this, they were planning a conflict with the Soviet Union before Germany had even surrendered. And the horrifying thing about our use of nuclear, the horrifying thing is the United States is the only country ever to use a nuclear weapon. And we did it on a country that was essentially defeated and it had already been tried to sue for peace. But that's been covered up, and a lot of Americans don't want to face up to that. And that's something that the American people should have to contend with. But they blot it out, or they're not ever taught it, So that's the horrifying reality of the situation.
Daniel Ellsberg, in reference to Hiroshima, talked about how whatever atrocities had been committed in America's past, at least people were rhetorically committed and ideally committed to human rights and that kind of thing. But with their kind of internalized apology and acceptance of the nuking, before that, the firebombing, but especially the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that they really changed into accepting a different kind of people, accepting a brand new, a different morality altogether that said that actually killing women and children can be noble and good and great, and in certain circumstances, if your government decides so, and that kind of thing, which really makes beasts out of Americans, where before they weren't quite that bad.
Even on the utilitarian level, that was wrong, because I think the Strategic Bombing Survey of 1946, the U.S. government's own document, admitted that the bombing campaign over Europe, over Germany, and the bombing, the nuclear bombing of Japan were unnecessary to win the war. In fact, I think extensive studies have been done since then that actually the campaign over Europe, where I think the moral threshold was crossed, probably by 1942 by the British, and the U.S. picked it up when they started when they entered the war in 1941-42 in Europe. But they called it terror bombing, and the idea was to terrorize and kill as many civilians as possible, with the idea that would somehow affect the government. Of course, the government, the Nazi leadership, they're the ones in the bunkers. It was the hoi polloi who are being firebombed and melted in the streets and being suffocated in the firestorms. And, close to 1 million civilians died in that campaign. And, if anything, it consumed immense resources, particularly from the Battle of the Atlantic, where the only chance there was a chance even to knock the Americans out of the war would be with submarine warfare in the Atlantic. And it took terrific resources away from that campaign and put them over the skies of Europe, where all it did was reap destruction, and made the occupation of Europe that much more difficult and more vulnerable to the Soviets, by the way, after the war. And the government admits that itself in the Strategic Bombing Survey. And when I point that out to people, to the extent they're willing to listen, if they don't get a glassy-eyed stare, they simply don't care, and it's very upsetting, because I was raised to think that killing civilians, and killing women and children, and killing people was wrong. And since the total wars of the 20th century, Americans tend to revel in it in a way, long as it's over there, far away. Mm-hmm. And that's the upsetting thing about it is, the irony is that there's no more warlike people than the American people, yet there's no people that have been so immune or so removed from warfare. I guess that's understandable to a certain degree. You know what I mean? Yeah. They don't see the consequences of it. To them, it's something they see old movies, and and so they don't see the full effects of it.
Well, part of it is just the kind of civic religion of democracy, where if there was an election and these people took power by way of that election, then whatever they decide is ultimately right, because it's ultimately what most people want. And that's what people believe. And they sort of, I don't know which comes first, the majority opinion or the morality of a thing. Sometimes it's hard to tell. But ultimately, anything that they do comes with that kind of acceptance. I mean, what does it mean to live in North Dakota other than to live on a giant H-bomb target? But why? Why should the people in North Dakota have to have their government draw a big red target on their head when, hell, they could just use submarines or whatever? They don't have to, deliberately make targets out of the American people the way that they do with all their silos and whatever, and yet they persist. All their airfields.
Well, it's important to reiterate that, again, nuclear warfare, that genie was released by the American government. The government re-elected, or, they elected, then I wasn't alive then, so I don't really accept responsibility for it. I don't know if I really believe in collective guilt, at least, the U.S. government created this weapon, and it was unnecessary. It wasn't necessary for the standpoint of national security. It was developed as an offensive weapon. somehow to impress the Soviets. And the only problem with that is all the Soviets did was kick in and speed up their development program, a development program which was highly aided by their infiltration of the Manhattan Project. And so you could say the Manhattan Project was Stalin's research and development program. And it was, and so it did not, the irony is that suppose we went to war in World War II to defend the country, and we emerged from that war. We went into that war in an invulnerable power because we had the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, and within a few years of that war, we were facing a power which had the ability to bomb and destroy the country by the 60s. And so even from that standard of national security, the war did not help national security. It made us more vulnerable. So.
Well, and now, as you say, too, the vast numbers of the nuclear weapons stockpiled by the United States, they were there to, in the name of keeping the Russians from pouring through the Fulda Gap and into Western Europe. And yet, it would only take a few nukes. I mean, even with all of those Soviet tank divisions, it still would only take a few nukes to take out some Soviet tank divisions, in a big valley. What the hell do they need 10,000 for? But it's because of this mad theory, all capitals, mutually assured destruction, where these Dr. Strangelove, math genius types are so smart, they figure out some, game formula which says all we need to do is be armed to the teeth. And I really like the way you say in the article that it could be that the lack of nuclear war since the advent of mutually assured destruction is actually, these aren't your exact words, but something like this, that it could just be a coincidence. We might just find out that actually this policy is only kind of good for deterring full-scale war, but not that good, and we might only find out the hard way. That sometimes a politician will be bad enough to do such a thing as set one of these things off. Harry Truman proves it.
Well, the reason I'm bringing that up is I made that point several times just talking to people over the years. Because I hear that running in the circles I run in, whether it's, right-wing conservative people who I would say I identify more with them than I do with the left wing, although I don't myself right-wing anymore. I just have certain viewpoints based on what I observe and based on the values that I was raised with. But I would say that, well, nuclear weapons, they're horrible, but they kept the peace. And I said, well, okay, maybe they didn't keep peace. It's just luck. And one thing is we were aware of at least 20 separate instances where false alarms almost resulted in the launching of weapons. And I just write about, I think, 3 or 4 in the article, just in the interest of brevity. But it just shows just because a few people who kept their cool and violated standard operating procedure, and that's why the missiles weren't launched. It was just a mistake, and they identified it as a mistake. But what if they hadn't? And it's that's the scary thing. It's whoops. Okay, so the theory's wrong. I like you mentioned the idea of game theory because I did. The MAD wasn't so much developed out of a strategic reality or necessity. It was developed, I think, was it John Nash, and his game theory. And if I'm wrong, you can correct me, but I think he's the one that came up with game theory. And it's interesting to point out that he was also a paranoid schizophrenic. So, he's the one developing the policy. And
maybe more of a psycho. Well, and then, of course, there's Albert Wohlstetter, who was a former Trotskyite, like his buddy Leo Strauss, teaching at the University of Chicago, and mentor to Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, who he then sent off to go work in Henry Scoop Jackson's office, and the rest is history.
The senator from Boeing.
And his whole thing was how do you fight and win a nuclear war? Not how do you stay out of one, but how can we keep a nuclear war limited enough but still get to use nukes enough that we come out on top of the thing at the end?
Well, that was insane. I mean, I think it was Thomas Powers who succeeded Curtis LeMay at SAC. Curtis LeMay called him demented and a statist. And that's Curtis LeMay talking, okay? Thomas Powers, I think he's the one that said, when someone mentioned nuclear restraint or restraint, our idea is to win, and if there's 2 Americans standing and only 1 Russian standing, or 2 and no Russian standing, we win.
Yeah.
And that attitude was parodied wonderfully, of course, in Dr. Strangelove with George C. Scott, I think it was Buck Turgidson, I think was his name, General Buck Turgidson. The scary thing about Dr. Strangelove, the movie, is that it's not that far removed from reality.
Right.
It's just how crazy it is.
Yeah, all you have to do is define victory way, way down, and then it works.
Yeah.
You know, as long, hey, all we're talking about is words here, right? Not actual death and pain. Well, now, here's the thing that I just can't get over. And that is the story of Reykjavik. Of course, Norman Podhoretz and the rest of the neocons denounced Reagan, Richard Pearl too, denounced Ronald Reagan because he even came close to making a deal with Mikhail Gorbachev at the height of the Cold War, or one of the heights of the Cold War, there in the late 1980s. And, of course, the only deal breaker, at least according to the myth now, is that Reagan had been made to believe in the magic of the nuclear shield, the anti-missile system that would be, you know, effective enough to actually implement to protect America from Soviet attack. And he had promised the American people he was going to build one of those, and so he wouldn't break on that. Gorbachev should have just said fine, because he knew it was all a comic book anyway, but he couldn't or didn't. And so the deal fell apart. But anyway, my point being, Reagan was ready to negotiate an end to the possession of all nuclear weapons with the Soviet Union still existing. And as far as he knew at that time, it was going to continue to exist, at least for the medium term or something. And now here we are 20 years out from the fall of the USSR. Eastern Europe is all in NATO now. And instead of being willing to negotiate an end to this mad policy, we act like Russia's still the USSR. I mean, it's not like there's a new continent with a new power for us to pretend is a menace. We just still got our same old enemies because we got nobody else to mess with. You know, who do we need nukes for? The Syrians or something, you know?
Well, that's what happened. I think that's what happened with me personally when I observed in the 90s and, into the 2000s, the existence of NATO, despite the fact that the Warsaw Pact went the way of the dodo, so did the Soviet Union, and it expanded. And it showed that NATO and much of the Cold War was largely a myth or a fake conflict stirred up, I think, by military-industrial complexers, I guess imperialists within the American government, and I can use that word now. It used to be dirty. You never could call them imperialists now. Now they openly bragged about it 10 years ago, being, comparing themselves to the New Rome and all that stuff, But, it's one of these things that I think what happened was that during the war, World War II, you had an arsenal democracy kind of morphed or developed into the military-industrial complex, and you had certain financial, political, corporate interests develop, and not to mention the fact that even before the war, and the Council of Foreign Relations, I think it was the War and Peace Studies program, calling for American dominance after the war. This is 1939. So this planning goes way back, and you can go down the rabbit hole on this stuff. I'm not sure if there's one grand conspiracy for it, but you do have this idea of corporate political interest within the Anglo-American power structure planning for domination. And it kind of coincided with the bankruptcy and collapse of the British Empire, and Americans took up the imperial mantle. And the English-speaking peoples, as Winston Churchill would say, would continue to dominate the world. This isn't to say that the Soviet Union wasn't an evil empire or didn't oppress its people, but they never, I don't think they ever really planned global domination. There's no evidence for that. Their leaders paid tribute to Marxist rhetoric and all that stuff. But if you look at what they did after the war, Stalin pursued a rather traditional Russian foreign policy, whether that's vis-a-vis Turkey, and what he seized right after the war is pretty much what FDR had given him, and that somehow became evidence of a plan to conquer Western Europe, and that if you look at it, that's just retrospect, they were in no position to conquer Europe in 1946, 1947. They just suffered grievously from the Nazi invasion, and a war, which is, albeit they helped start with Poland. But even then, if you look at it, traditionally, German and Russian aggression against Poland was a reversion back to what Europe had been, for hundreds of years. Poland had only been in existence for 20 years. I love the Polish. I love, the Polish people are great people, and I like to see their independence. But I don't think it necessitated British or American or French intervention. And I think Pat Buchanan did a good job of writing about that in his book, The Unnecessary War. How that whole thing was sparked because of Britain's intervention, Britain's blank check to Poland. And I'm going back in World War II, but obviously Cold War developed out of World War II. But if you look at the map of Europe after World War II, Stalin had pretty much taken what he had been ceded to him. There was a inevitable result of the unconditional surrender policy of the U.S. government towards Germany. So it was not like it was unforeseen, and one looks at it and it looks like at what was happening and must conclude that the war planners and people within the American power structure took it as an excuse to justify American presence or a continued American presence or domination over Europe.
Right. Well, and you think about what a dangerous game they were playing when it comes to the Cuban Missile Crisis and things like that. And even as you say in this article,
out of control. Yeah.
All the false alarms where, somebody nukes somebody else's major city, even on a misunderstanding, they might just have to retaliate for their own domestic political concerns. And then these kinds of things, once you start throwing nukes around, these kinds of things we could guess would tend to escalate, if more than one side has them. And I remember, and this is typical of what probably Republicans and Democrats of all stripes think too, but I remember 1998 when the Pakistanis and the Indians were testing their nukes, as though both sides didn't already know that they had them and that they worked, but they're just, playing this brinksmanship. And they showed this Pakistani general on one of these CNNs or something saying, you tell those Indians that we're not afraid of them and their atom bombs. I'm just thinking, you could really, really be strong in the arms, but still that's not going to do you much good against a nuke, Come on, guys.
Yeah, I don't. They're literally. You're talking about. It's almost like.
That's the thinking that goes into the policy. It's like, well, we're not scared. That's basically what that guy was a general,
Yeah, well, that's what again, go back to Dr. Strange, though. That's a scene where Dorsey Scott from Buck Jurgensen recognizes what's happening. He says, well, since those planes have been sent, here's our chance for a first strike and knock out our enemy. We may get hit, and the general and the president respond. You're talking about the deaths of millions of people, and the general response, I'm not saying we won't get our hair mussed, and that's the attitude. And, I think it was Curtis LeMay who was disappointed the Cuban Missile Crisis ended the way it did, peacefully. Because he wanted to attack Cuba. And it turns out now that the missiles were ready to launch. So it would have sent those, the missiles would have been launched if Kennedy had attacked Cuba.
Yep.
But that for Curtis LeMay, I guess a few million dead Americans juxtaposed to wiping out the Soviet Union was worth it. So,
right. It. Well, and that's the whole thing. It would have been the end of both nations. Any attack upon the United States by the Cubans will mean an attack on the U.S. by the USSR, and we'll respond in kind, Kennedy said. So you had taken his word on that one anyway. You can always, when these guys promise to kill people by the hundreds of millions, you can believe that, It's the one thing that politicians are honest about. Is how horrible they can be.
Total war, and that moral threshold was crossed in World War II definitively. You could see shades of it in the American Civil War and in World War I. But I think World War II was the first war where the civilian casualties far outweighed the combatants.
And the thing is, I really appreciate your Cold War revisionism too, and we don't get nearly enough of that, and I'm with you on it. But, when I was a kid in the 80s, you could look at a globe and at least there really was a USSR that dominated a third of the world. Whatever their intentions, characterize them however you want. At least such a thing existed. Now it's just plain old Russia again. They don't have an offensive policy of any kind whatsoever. And we still got thousands of nukes 20 years later. So where the hell does that leave us? What is this? It's completely out of control. You'd think they'd be down to just a couple of hundred, which is still enough to kill us all. Nuclear winter and everything.
I think, given the special interests that do exist, that are ensconced in the various bureaucracies, and it's hard to, again, I don't think there's any distinction between the U.S. government and corporatism, the corporations and all that stuff, whether it's, Wall Street, CIA, Pentagon, they're all interlocked. And you can really go down the rabbit hole in that one if you want. I mean, and I don't know the answer to that. It's a field of study that's worth study. I like to read about it, but I think peace is bad for business. You don't want to, if you're making swords, you don't want to make plowshares anymore. And there's less money in it. And given the financial military structure of the United States, it's based on a sort of this warfare corporatism.
Sure. Well, you know what? At Movies Found Online, people can watch The Merchants of Death, all about the proto-military industrial complex during World War I. And that's just the taste of, where we're headed for the rest of the century or whatever, and it was put together, I think, in 1930, something like that.
Yeah, and it goes into whether it's the issuance of bonds to pay for the war, the armies that ultimately collect on the bonds or enforce the currency. You really there's no one explanation for it because there's so many interests involved in this. But if you look at the countries that have been at the receiving end of U.S. military power in the past 12 years, these are countries that have challenged the petrodollar and the U.S. dollar as a world reserve currency. And that if you challenge the dollar, undermine the dollar, you undermine ultimately the financial power of the U.S. empire, the system we live under.
Yeah, and we'll inflate trillions of dollars to pay for wars to destroy you if you dare. And that'll get our work done.
And the misery that causes globally, the ripple effect of that is hard to track, which is why it makes it politically hard to criticize in electoral politics, because the economic understanding of the American people is abysmal. Their historical knowledge is abysmal. They're too busy working, raising their family to keep up with these things. If you look at U.S. foreign policy, it just casually mentioned whether it's the explosions of the size of JSOC and all these clandestine operations all over the planet. How do you keep track of this stuff? How does an American citizen who's supposed to vote in his government, vote elected representatives to decide policy, make those decisions if they don't know what's going on? And we've had this huge explosion of these clandestine operations, whether it's CIA, even to the Pentagon. I think JSOC's expanded from 18,000 to 80,000. And they're doing all types of these daring do secret operations all around the world. We don't know what's going on. They're stirring up all types of trouble, waging war in various parts of the world, low-grade war in various parts of the world. And we wonder why, people do bad things to us, why they resent the U.S. government, the U.S. policy. And, but then we're supposed to admire this stuff because they make movies about this stuff. What was that movie that recently came out last summer, that Code of Honor, about the SEALs or something, or Act of Valor or something?
I didn't see it, but I think I know the one you're talking about, where they use actual Special Forces guys instead of pretend Special Forces guys for the movie. And,
but all this is considered great. This makes us feel good about being Americans. We can feel tough. We can watch war on our flat screen TV sets and think this is great. And, you can't go to any sporting event anymore without some flyover and some military parade. And it's very uncomfortable for me because I simply disagree with all these policies, and I like baseball.
Well, that's the thing. There's a lot splendid about our isolation over here in North America, and people ought to be able to live their lives if they want. There's a lot of people in Texas, I promise you, who never leave their county their whole life long, and that's just fine. And they shouldn't have to care about what the hell is going on in Mali right now. The only reason they have to care about what's going on in Mali right now is because it's their government's fault. So they got to take some time to take a little bit of responsibility to try to stop them anyway. It seems like I wouldn't make them, but I'd suggest it.
Yeah, when government takes over, when government assumes the responsibility to provide national security, whatever that means, that's the potential for a huge boondoggle, right? I mean, that's and they're in a position to define what is national security. And when you have a foreign policy establishment, the experts that study foreign policy, well, then by and large, foreign policy experts aren't going to argue for America first or a genuine foreign policy geared towards real interests or protecting the country, because doing that would cut into their budget, and there'd be a lot less jobs out there for foreign policy experts. my field of study is foreign policy. I want the government doing a lot of things overseas. That way I can use the excuse to give all the lectures and write books about it. It doesn't to say there aren't foreign policy experts, that take the truth to power. I mean, there's Ivan Eland, and there's I think he does good work on this. A couple people like Cato and stuff like that. But who are they? I mean, no one really listens to them.
Well, that's kind of what's cool about it, is how above board the corruption all is. It's just a simple revolving door type thing. Any number of public interest groups could identify it for you. The companies who are making money off of the governmental policies spend fractions of the amounts of money they make on lobbying to get those policies their way. And then, of course, there's the bureaucrats themselves and their interest in what they want to do. And together, working together, these guys make sure that each other's paid and that their policies get implemented and everybody else in the country be damned. So it's not really a big secret or a secret handshake or a big kind of anything mysterious about it at all. It's just a plain old conflict of interest, and it's all over the place in Washington, D.C.
Well, I think a few years ago there was I forget who wrote the article, Lockheed and Bruce Jackson, and he happened to be on the Committee for the Expansion of NATO and the Committee for the Liberation of Iraq.
Exactly.
All these programs.
Richard Cummings.
Bruce Jackson.
Peace.
And and of course he's the head of business development, and of course those policies increase the stock value of Lockheed Martin and many other companies. And
hey, we just had a great talk with Dina Razor from Truth Out. She's the founder of the Project on Government Oversight, and she reminded us all about how the M1A Abrams tank was politically guaranteed and set up by Donald Rumsfeld back in the Ford years as simply a bailout for Chrysler, because they had made the terrible and useless and overly fuel-hungry turbine engine system for the damn thing. When everybody else's tank just runs on diesel, it works. Go along with that. But no, Rumsfeld did this, and it was just a political thing for Chrysler. And of course, it's a death trap if you try to take it to war in Iraq or Afghanistan. They'll kill you, and it'll be your coffin.
Yeah, the procurement is often used to bail out corporations. That happened a number of times where you just pretty much give a fat contract to a corporation, and that's often admitted. They say, "Well, we may not need this weapons platform. It may be antiquated, but we need an industrial base to produce these weapons for national security." And that's when you had the creation of a permanent military industrial complex that Eisenhower spoke about in his farewell speech. It used to be that what happened was that if there was a crisis, the industrial capacity was switched over to build for the crisis, and after the war it became permanent, and it became the gift that kept on giving.
Well, I went to Virginia to Future Freedom Foundation conference back in 2008, and I remember on the cab ride to the hotel thinking, wow, hey, look, there's Raytheon, and there's General Dynamics, and there's Military Industrial Complex Incorporated right there all around me. It seems like it would be a shameful, covert thing that they would have just a little office park back in the suburbs, but nope, they got big old giant towers bragging about it. They're making the most money anybody in the country probably right now. Yeah,
the D.C. area is doing very well, so don't worry about me. But it's like that. It's the new Versailles, I guess. Sucking life out of the rest of the country, rest of the world right now. And the clock is ticking now. I think the game with the music is playing is about to stop, because I don't know if the Chinese, the Germans, and whoever's buying our bonds. I think the Fed's buying most of the bonds now, which is a signal that it could be ending soon. And I don't know how it will end, but it's hard to say how the politics will play out. I'd like to think we had our chance with Ron Paul Rand. He told the nation what needs to be done. He still does. We need to slash everything. We need something that what the country needs to do. It needs a budget cut like it got after World War II, where 2/3 of the federal budget was just slashed, and all the key leaders saying, "Oh no, what's going to happen? We're going to have a return to the Great Depression. We had a great recovery." Because all those resources were then returned back to the civilian economy, and not to mention all the liberalization that occurred in the U.S. economy at the time. And
Right, for about 4 years until Truman diverted all the profits into more bombers and more nukes.
Well, Korea
more occupation of Europe.
Acheson, Korea saved us. What do they mean by that?
Yeah, well, and the French need a hand down in Indochina. We need to go ahead and get that started too. All right, I'm sorry. We're all out of time. We're right up against the wall. Okay. I really appreciate your time. It's been great, Tim.
Thanks, Scott. Have a good night.
Good talk to you. All right, everybody. That's Tim Kelly from the Future of Freedom Foundation and a correspondent for Radio America's special investigator.